What Europe learned by almost failing. It did not end in collapse. That was a surprise. Everything that should have broken held together, just barely. And in that narrow space between survival and failure, Europe learned more than it ever had during calm. To understand why this moment still matters, we must return to the edge itself. Systems were stretched across borders, institutions, and expectations. Each safeguard worked, but only because another one did too. No single pillar failed, but none could have stood alone. Stability existed, not as strength, but as interdependence pushed to its limit. The first reveal begins with proximity. This was not a distant crisis, observed through reports. Decision-makers felt how close outcomes were to slipping beyond control. Timelines compressed. Margins vanished. Assumptions were tested simultaneously. What saved the system was not perfection, but overlap, multiple imperfect defenses activating together. The second beat followed as hindsight clarified what the moment exposed. Europe did not almost fail because of one error. It almost failed because of alignment. Too many risks had been tolerated at once. Too many safeguards assumed others would compensate. The system survived, but only because luck and coordination arrived together. What made this episode different from past crises was awareness. Participants recognized how narrow the margin truly was. Survival did not feel like success. It felt like warning. The calm that followed carried weight, not relief. Everyone understood that repeating the same structure would not guarantee the same outcome. By the time stability returned fully, the lesson was already forming. Systems do not fail only when something breaks. They fail when everything must work at once to avoid breaking. Near failure reveals fragility more clearly than collapse ever could. Europe had not been defeated, but had been shown how close it came, and that knowledge would shape everything that followed. As reflection set in, the near failure reframed how resilience was understood. Survival no longer felt like proof of strength. It felt like evidence of vulnerability narrowly escaped. Institutions replayed the sequence, not to assign blame, but to locate dependence. What became clear was how many outcomes relied on timing rather than capacity. The reveal deepened as hidden connections surfaced. Safeguards were linked in ways few had mapped fully. One delay would have triggered another. One miscommunication would have cascaded. The system had not been designed to operate at its limit, yet it had been forced there. Stability held, but only because pressure was evenly distributed by chance. The conflict emerged in interpretation. Some argued the system had proven its resilience. Others warned it had proven the opposite. Near failure could be read as success or as warning, depending on comfort with risk. The debate was not technical. It was philosophical. Was survival enough, or did it signal that limits had been ignored for too long? The buildup intensified as reforms were discussed. Fixing one weakness felt insufficient when fragility came from alignment, not failure. Strengthening everything was impossible. Choices had to be made about which risks to reduce and which to tolerate. Almost failing had revealed scarcity, of attention, of margin, of control. Public narratives softened the episode. Crisis avoided. Lessons learned. Confidence restored. Inside institutions, the memory lingered differently. The system had come too close to trust and luck. And luck, once relied upon, cannot be counted on again. By this stage, the realization was shared quietly. Near failure was not an anomaly. It was a preview, and whether it became a lesson or a rehearsal depended on what Europe chose to change next. The tension deepened as Europe confronted what almost failing had truly revealed. The danger had not come from a single weakness, but from accumulation. Small risks, acceptable in isolation, had aligned under pressure. Each was manageable alone. Together, they nearly overwhelmed the system. The conflict sharpened as policymakers faced an uncomfortable mirror. Risk had been spread widely, but not reduced. Safeguards existed, but they depended on one another. Resilience had been defined as redundancy, not independence. When everything was needed at once, redundancy became illusion. The buildup intensified when simulations confirmed the fear. Slightly different timing would have changed outcomes. A delayed signal, a slower response, a misjudged assumption. Near failure was not dramatic. It was ordinary circumstances stacked too closely together. The system had not been unlucky. It had been exposed. Inside institutions, priorities began shifting. The focus moved away from optimizing efficiency toward restoring margin. Buffers were reconsidered. Dependencies mapped more honestly. The goal was no longer to make systems work perfectly, but to ensure they could fail partially without dragging everything else with them. This realization altered the emotional tone of governance. Confidence gave way to humility. Certainty was replaced by caution. The belief that complexity alone created safety was questioned. Simplicity regained value, not as retreat, but as protection against alignment of failure. By this stage, almost failing had done something collapse never could. It forced recognition without destruction. The system remained standing, but its limits were now visible. Europe understood that stability is not measured by how much stress can be absorbed, but by how little needs to be absorbed at once. The lesson was no longer abstract. It was structural, and it demanded change not driven by fear, but by memory. The reckoning settled in slowly, without drama. Europe did not respond in near failure with sweeping revolution. It responded with restraint shaped by memory. The goal was no longer to prove strength, but to reduce dependence on perfect alignment. Stability would be rebuilt around margin, not precision. The climax unfolded as priorities shifted across institutions. Redundancy was redesigned to avoid simultaneous dependence. Buffers were restored where efficiency had thinned them too far. Some connections were deliberately weakened so that stress could break locally instead of spreading globally. The system accepted that controlled failure was safer than total reliance on success. This marked a quiet but profound change in thinking. Resilience stopped meaning the ability to withstand anything. It began to mean the ability to fail without collapse. Planning moved away from best-case coordination toward worst-case independence. Stability was no longer assumed to be automatic. It was treated as something that required upkeep. The resolution emerged over time, not as confidence regained, but as humility embedded. Decisions slowed where speed had proven dangerous. Assumptions were documented instead of inherited. Stress was introduced deliberately, not avoided, to keep systems honest about their limits. Europe did not aim to eliminate risk. It aimed to prevent too much of it from arriving at once. What endured from almost failing was clarity. Survival had not been victory. It had been warning. The system learned that the absence of collapse does not equal safety. Near failure reveals truths that success conceals. And remembering those truths is what prevents repetition. Europe did not wait for collapse to change. It learned just enough, just in time. So what do you think? Are we designing systems to survive failure, or still hoping everything works perfectly when it matters most? What